The clay feels cold even through archival gloves. In the climate-controlled vault beneath Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, a curator lifts an object from its custom housing, a four-sided prism of baked clay, roughly 8 inches tall, covered in columns of wedge-shaped marks, pressed into its surface over 4,000 years ago. The artefact weighs perhaps 2 pounds, but what it contains has troubled scholars since its discovery in 1922. The Well-Blundell prism, catalogue number WB62, is the most complete version of the Sumerian king list ever recovered. Unlike fragments found scattered across Iraq, this single object preserves an unbroken account of rulership stretching back to what the text calls when kingship descended from heaven. Before you continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop your location in the comments. There's something grounding about knowing we're scattered across the world, all drawn to the same ancient mystery. The prism's curator turns it slowly under the light. The cuneiform is crisp, the hand of the scribe confident. This is not a rough draft or a damaged copy. This is a finished document, an official record, and what it records should be impossible. According to the opening lines of the prism, before a great flood swept across the earth, 8 kings ruled the land of Sumer. The text provides their names, their cities, and the lengths of their reigns. The shortest ruled for 18,600 years. The longest sat upon the throne for 43,200 years. Combined, these 8 kings reigned for a total of 241,200 years. Then, the text states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more. But this time, the reign lengths are different, still extraordinary by our standards. Some rulers governing for hundreds of years, but no longer stretching into the tens of thousands. The post-flood kings begin to approach something closer to human lifespans, though still extended far beyond what we consider normal. Here is what troubles the academic mind. This is not mythology in the way we understand myths. The Sumerian king list is a historical document. It was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, its contents updated as new dynasties rose and fell. Archaeological excavations have confirmed many of the cities named in the text. Inscriptions from multiple rulers mentioned on the list have been found in situ at their supposed capitals. The document transitions seamlessly from these impossibly long-reigned antediluvian kings to historically verified rulers, whose palace foundations we've excavated, whose trade records we've translated, whose wars and building projects left physical evidence we can carbon date. The king list doesn't distinguish between the mythical and the historical. It presents one continuous record. It treats the 43,000-year reign of Anulim of Eridu with the same documentary tone it uses for Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose actual reign we can now date to approximately 2700 BCE. So we face a question. Either the Sumerians, who invented writing, mathematics, the wheel, urban planning, and the first law codes, couldn't tell the difference between fantasy and fact, or they were recording something they believed to be true in a way we don't yet understand. There's a third possibility, one that requires us to ask not whether the numbers are accurate, but what the numbers represent. What if the king list isn't primarily about individual rulers at all? What if it's documenting something else? A system of knowledge transmission that operated across timescales far longer than human lifetimes? What if kingship in this context means something more than political authority? What if it means custodianship? The records don't say kings invented civilization. They say kingship descended from heaven. They say knowledge was given. They say certain bloodlines were chosen to preserve and transmit that knowledge forward through time. And when you read the broader corpus of Sumerian texts, the creation accounts, the temple dedications, the educational tablets from the scribal schools, the succession chronicles of the priesthoods, a pattern emerges. A pattern suggesting that access to certain forms of knowledge was understood to be hereditary, that it passed through family lines, that it required not just training, but bloodline, that some information could only be held, understood, and transmitted by those born into specific lineages. The texts don't present this as metaphor, they document it as procedure. This is the story those documents tell, if we let them speak on their own terms. Not aliens, not mythology, something stranger, a civilization that organised itself around the preservation of inherited knowledge and left us a 4,000-year paper trail explaining exactly how they did it. The prism sits in its vault in Oxford, the wedges pressed into clay, the record unbroken. Let's follow what it actually says. When kingship descended from heaven. To understand what the Sumerian king list reveals about bloodlines and knowledge, we first need to understand who created it, when, where and why. Sumer, the land at the southern tip of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, is where civilization, as we define it, began. Not because humans were more intelligent there or more ambitious, but because the conditions aligned. Two rivers flooding annually, depositing rich alluvial soil, a flat landscape requiring cooperation to manage water through irrigation, and most importantly, a surplus of food that freed some percentage of the population from constant subsistence farming to pursue specialized trades. By 3500 BC, the Sumerians had developed the world's first cities, not towns, not villages, cities in the full sense, dense urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands, organised around temple complexes, supported by agricultural hinterlands, conducting trade across hundreds of miles. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, each was a city-state, independent but culturally unified, sharing a language, a writing system, and a cosmology. That writing system is crucial. Around 3200 BC, temple administrators in Uruk began pressing marks into clay tablets to track grain stores, livestock, and labour. These marks evolved rapidly from simple pictograms into cuneiform, a full writing system capable of recording the Sumerian language in all its grammatical complexity. By 2600 BCE, Sumerians were writing poetry, legal codes, mathematical treatises, medical texts, and historical chronicles. The king list belongs to this chronicle tradition. It was first compiled during the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, though it draws on older records that date back centuries earlier. Multiple copies exist. At least 16 fragments or complete versions have been recovered from sites across southern Iraq. The Weld Blundell prism, discovered during Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s, remains the most complete single version. The purpose of the king list was political, at least on its surface. The third dynasty of Ur was attempting to reunify southern Mesopotamia after a period of fragmentation. By presenting kingship as a single divine office that moved from city to city but remained continuous and unified, the compilers were arguing that legitimate rule could only belong to one dynasty at a time, currently their own. It was propaganda, in the best sense, an argument for order based on historical precedent. But the compilers didn't invent their content. They worked from older documents. We know this because variant versions of the king list survive with different details, and because some sections of the list correlate with independent inscriptions found at excavation sites. When the king list says that Messanaparta ruled Ur for 80 years and founded its first dynasty, we can check that claim against royal inscriptions found at Ur itself. When it names Emebragesi as king of Kish, we find his name on other contemporary documents. The king list is not pure fabrication, it's compilation. Archaeological excavations over the past century have confirmed the basic framework. The cities named existed. The dynasties, stripped of their extraordinary chronology, align with stratigraphic evidence. There was indeed a massive flood event in Mesopotamia dated to approximately 2900 BC that left a distinctive sterile clay layer in multiple excavation sites, Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak. Sumerian civilization continued after this flood, but the king list marks it as a fundamental rupture, a before and after. This brings us back to the problem. The king list is not a mythological poem. It's structured as a chronicle, updated across centuries as historical records were. Yet it begins with content that cannot be historical in the conventional sense. 8 kings ruling for a combined 240,000 years. The mainstream scholarly interpretation is straightforward. The antediluvian section is mythology. The post-flood section gradually transitions into history, and the compilers either didn't distinguish between the two categories or deliberately included mythological content to give divine legitimacy to the historical dynasties that followed. The enormous reign lengths, scholars argue, may result from errors in sexagesimal mathematics, the Sumerian-based 60 number system in which the symbols for 1 and 60 are easily confused. Alternatively, they may represent not individual reigns, but dynasties or eras, or they may simply be mythological exaggeration, the kind of legendary prehistory common to many cultures. These are reasonable interpretations. They solve the problem neatly. They allow us to preserve the king list as a valuable historical source, while dismissing its troubling opening section as primitive mythology. But they don't account for how carefully the Sumerians themselves treated these records. They don't explain why the text maintains its documentary tone throughout, never shifting into the poetic register used for myths. They don't address why the king list was copied and preserved for over 1,000 years with such consistency. And they don't consider what happens when we read the king list not in isolation, but alongside the other texts the Sumerians left us. The texts about knowledge, about creation, about the transfer of divine powers from gods to humans, about who could hold that knowledge and why. Because the king list is not the only document that presents kingship as something descended from heaven rather than invented on earth. It's not the only text that links political authority to bloodline rather than ability. It's not the only record suggesting that certain families held roles that could not be occupied by outsiders. The Sumerians left us thousands of tablets. When we read them together, they describe a system in which knowledge was hereditary, in which access required ancestry, in which preservation of what they called the ME, the divine powers or principles that structured civilization, depended on specific bloodlines maintaining continuity across time. The king list, read in this context, is not a mythological king list with historical appendices. It's a record of custodianship, a document tracking which lineages held the knowledge, and for how long, and what happened when the chain was broken. That reading doesn't solve the problem of the numbers, but it reframes the question. Not did these kings really rule for 40,000 years, but what does 40,000 years of continuity represent? We'll return to that question. First, we need to understand what the texts say happened before the flood, because that's where the system begins. The problem of the 8 kings. The opening lines of the Well-Blundell prism are formulaic, precise, bureaucratic. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. No preamble, no creation myth. The text begins with kingship already existing in heaven, then descending to earth, then being held by a specific individual in a specific city. Alulim is not a god. He is called king, the same term used for historically verified rulers later in the document. His reign has a definite length. When it ends, another king succeeds him. Alungar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings ruled for 64,800 years. The text continues through 8 kings total. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alungar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Emen-Luana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Enmen-Garlana of Bad Tibira, 28,800 years. Dumuzid Bad Tabira 36,000 years, Insipid Ana of Larak 28,800 years, Emenjuan of Sippar 21,000 years, Ubara Tutu of Shuruppak 18,600 years, total 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. The variant king list found at Ashmolean Museum, WB444, provides slightly different numbers but maintains the same structure: 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, flood. Another tablet excavated at Nippur lists only 5 of the 8 but with similar chronology. The consistency across independent manuscripts suggests these weren't copying errors. This was the received tradition. Mainstream scholarship offers several explanations. The first is mathematical confusion. Cuneiform numerals used a sexagesimal system where a vertical wedge could mean 1 or 60 depending on position and context. A scribe copying from a damaged source might misread 600 as 36,000 if the positional markers were unclear. This could account for some of the inflation, but it doesn't account for all of it. The numbers are too consistent across manuscripts, and crucially, they decrease in a pattern. The post-flood kings in the king list don't suddenly drop to normal human lifespans. They decrease gradually. First dynasty of Kish after the flood, kings ruling 1200 to 500 years. First dynasty of Uruk, 1200 years average. First dynasty of Ur, 400-800 years. Second dynasty of Kish, 200-600 years. Only by the time we reach the historically verified kings, around 2600 Basidu, the reign lengths approach plausible lifespans, though even then many are listed at 100-120 years. This graduated decline suggests intentional pattern rather than random error. Something is being measured that decreases over time. The second scholarly explanation treats the antediluvian kings as purely mythological, legendary founder figures invented to give ancient prestige to later dynasties, similar to how medieval European dynasties claim descent from Trojan heroes. Every culture invents a glorious past. The Sumerians are no exception. This interpretation acknowledges that some names on the antediluvian list appear in other Sumerian texts. Enmen-Durana, the seventh king, shares a name similar to Enmeduranki, a legendary king of Sippar who appears in Babylonian texts as the founder of divination practices and the first human initiated into divine mysteries. Dumuzid becomes a major deity in later Mesopotamian religion, associated with shepherds and fertility. Ubaratutu is named in the Eridu Genesis as the father of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. So these aren't random inventions. They're deeply embedded in Sumerian religious and cultural tradition. But does that make them historical? Here's where the conventional reading encounters difficulty. When we examine how the antediluvian kings are described in texts beyond the king list, they're not presented as mythological heroes in the way Hercules or King Arthur are. They're not depicted performing supernatural feats or fighting monsters. They're described as ruling cities, building temples, receiving divine instructions, and performing administrative functions. They're procedural figures, not legendary ones. The instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest pieces of Sumerian literature we possess, frames itself as advice given by the king Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra. Multiple copies of this text survive from as early as 2600 BC through to 1800 BC. The advice is practical: how to behave in society, how to choose a wife, how to manage property, how to speak to authorities. This is wisdom literature, not epic poetry, and it attributes itself to Shuruppak, whose father Ubaratutu is the eighth and final antediluvian king on the king list. The Eridu Genesis, which survives in fragmentary form on tablets from around 1600 BC, tells the story of the flood. It names Ziusudra, son of Ubaratutu, as the survivor whom the god Enki warns to build a boat. After 7 days and nights of storm, Ziusudra makes offerings to the gods An and Enlil, who grant him eternal life and settle him in Dilmun, a distant land. The text then continues by describing how cities were rebuilt after the flood and kingship was re-established. So we have a chain: Ubaratutu, antediluvian king fathers, Shurupak, who writes instructions for his sons Yasudra, who survives the flood and becomes the bridge to post-Diluvian civilization. This isn't disconnected mythology, it's genealogical continuity presented as the mechanism by which knowledge survived the catastrophe. A third scholarly explanation suggests that the years listed for antediluvian kings might represent something other than solar years, perhaps their lunar months, or regnal years calculated differently, or symbolic numbers with religious significance. The problem with this approach is that it introduces arbitrary conversion factors. If we divide 28,800 by 60, we get 480 years, still implausible. If we divide by 360, we get 80 years, possible, but why would the text switch units without indicating it, only to switch back to solar years for later kings? The most sophisticated version of this argument suggests the antediluvian numbers represent not individual reigns but institutional continuity. Perhaps Ululim ruled 28,800 years means the office of kingship was held in Eridu for 28,800 years, of which Ululim was the founding representative. In this reading, the king list is tracking dynasties, not individuals. This has appeal. It allows the king list to preserve genuine historical memory that Eridu was ancient Sumer's oldest city, that kingship began there, that certain cities maintained preeminence for vast stretches of time, while acknowledging the impossibility of individual lifespans. But it raises a question the text itself addresses. Why does the king list carefully distinguish between individuals and dynasties in the post-flood section, noting X kings ruled for Y years when summarising dynasties, but treat the antediluvian kings as individuals with specific names and sequential reigns? If the authors understood the concept of institutional continuity, why didn't they apply that language to the pre-flood period? Unless the distinction is intentional, unless the text is documenting something it understood to be different before the flood than after. What if the antediluvian kings weren't entirely human in the way we understand the term? The text never quite says they were. It says kingship descended from heaven. It says these figures ruled. It provides numbers that might measure something we don't yet have a framework to interpret. It places them before a catastrophic disruption after which the rules changed. There's a term in the king list that appears repeatedly in Sumerian religious texts, the Me. These were understood as divine powers or principles, not abstract concepts, but something more like portable packages of knowledge or authority that could be transferred, stolen, granted, or lost. Temples housed Me. Gods possessed Me. Kings received Me. The Me structured how civilization functioned. And according to multiple Sumerian texts, the Me came from the gods, specifically from Enki, god of wisdom, who held them in his temple in Eridu. Eridu, where kingship first descended. Eridu, where Ululim first ruled. The antediluvian section of the king list isn't mythology in the way we usually mean it. It's the institutional memory of when the system was established, when knowledge descended, when the first custodians were designated to guard it. The flood breaks that system, and what comes after is the long story of rebuilding it, maintaining it, transmitting it through human generations that no longer have direct access to its source. That's what makes Ziusudra important. He's the link, the one bloodline that crosses the rupture and preserves continuity. Let's examine what the texts say he preserved. Ziusudra and the continuity problem. The Eridu Genesis survives in fragmentary form on a tablet excavated at Nippur, now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The text is damaged, with significant sections lost, but what remains is extraordinary. After describing the creation of humanity and the founding of the first 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, the text transitions to divine council. The gods, disturbed by the noise and proliferation of humanity, decide to send a flood to destroy the population they created. but one god dissents, Enki, who had participated in creating humans in the first place. The tablet is damaged here, but the surviving fragments indicate that Enki warns a human named Ziusudra, described as the king and lustration priest. The text specifies that Ziusudra fashioned, being a seer, a statue of the god of giddiness, inducing ecstasy, and stood beside it, listening. Through this ritual mechanism, he receives divine instruction. What follows is the flood account, 7 days and nights of storm, the boat surviving, Ziusudra making offerings to Ananenlil. The gods, moved by his devotion, grant him life like a god, and settle him in Dilmun, a distant paradisal land. The tablet ends with a statement that kingship was restored and cities rebuilt. The parallels to the biblical Noah account are obvious, and scholars have long recognised that the Genesis flood narrative likely derives from earlier Mesopotamian sources, but the differences matter for our purposes. In Genesis, Noah is described as righteous and blameless among the people of his time. He's chosen for moral character. The knowledge he preserves is implicit, the knowledge of God, of righteousness, of how to maintain the created order. But it's not presented as technical knowledge or institutional wisdom. Noah builds the ark, survives, and repopulates the earth. Civilization rebuilds essentially from scratch. In the Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra is not primarily described as morally righteous. He's described by title, king and lustration priest. His father is Ubaratutu, the 8th and final antediluvian king. Ziusudra receives warning not through prophetic inspiration, but through ritual technology, the statue, the ecstatic trance, the position beside it, allowing him to hear divine communication. This is procedure, not revelation. And what happens after the flood is not just survival, it's restoration. The text explicitly states that after Ziusudra receives eternal life, kingship descended from heaven again. The institution returns. The system re-establishes. The Sumerian king list confirms this. Immediately after the line the flood swept over, it states, after the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Kish. But here's the puzzle. If kingship descends anew from heaven, why is continuity through Ziusudra important? Why does the Eridu Genesis emphasize that he's the son of the last pre-flood king? Why do multiple Sumerian texts trace post-flood dynasties back through him? Because kingship descending from heaven requires an earthly recipient, someone who knows how to hold it, someone prepared to receive it, someone from the line that held it before. In another Sumerian text, the Atrahasis epic, the flood survivor is named Atrahasis, exceedingly wars. The Akkadian version, preserved on tablets dating to around 1700 BCE, provides more detail about the creation of humanity. The gods, tired of labouring to feed themselves, create humans by mixing clay with the blood and flesh of a slaughtered god named Geshtu-i, specifically a god possessing intelligence. This divine intelligence becomes embedded in the human form. When the flood is sent, Atrahasis survives by divine intervention, but the text emphasizes that he preserves not just human life, but the knowledge of how to maintain the world. The gods need humans to worship them and provide offerings. Without humans, the divine order collapses. Atrahasis is the essential bridge preventing cosmic breakdown. In the later Gilgamesh epic, the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim. When Gilgamesh, seeking immortality, travels to the ends of the earth to find him, Utnapishtim tells the flood story and reveals the secret of a plant that grants eternal youth. Though Gilgamesh ultimately loses this plant, the pattern holds. The flood survivor possesses knowledge that survived the catastrophe, knowledge others seek. These are variants of the same tradition, preserved across more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian literature. The details shift, names change, emphasis varies, but the structure remains constant. Before the flood, there was a system. The flood disrupts it, one bloodline survives and restores it. Now consider what it means that Ziusudra is not just any survivor. He's the son of Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, the 8th antediluvian king. His father's name appears on the king list. His grandfather is presumably the 7th king. The line goes back to Alulim of Eridu, the first king, when kingship descended initially. The instructions of Shuruppak makes this genealogy explicit. The text frames itself as Shuruppak, another name for Ubaratutu, or possibly his city personified, instructing his son Ziusudra in how to behave, how to maintain order, how to transmit knowledge. And this text survives in multiple copies from between 2600 BC and 1800 BC, meaning it was copied, taught, and preserved for at least 800 years. Why preserve a text attributed to a pre-flood figure unless you believe it contains knowledge from before the rupture, unless it represents continuity with something older? The Sumerians treated these genealogies as meaningful. Royal inscriptions regularly trace lineage back multiple generations. Temple dedications name ancestors. Priesthoods pass from father to son or father to daughter with explicit notation. This isn't accidental, it's systemic. And the flood marks the breakpoint. The king list's reign lengths drop dramatically after it. The direct divine appointment seems to end. But the bloodline continues, through Ziusudra, through his descendants, through the families chosen before the catastrophe to carry forward what was given. This is not mythology in the sense of made-up stories explaining natural phenomena. This is institutional memory, the record of how knowledge survived a civilizational collapse, the documentation of which families held the continuity. Whether the flood was the localized Mesopotamian inundation archaeologists have dated to around 2900 BCE, or a larger catastrophe remembered across cultures, or something else entirely, the texts agree on its meaning. It nearly broke the chain, and preserving the chain was important enough that the gods intervened to save one bloodline capable of rebuilding. What was in that bloodline? What did it carry? The creation texts might give us an answer: blood, clay, and divine intelligence. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in fragmentary form on tablets from the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, contains one of the most detailed Mesopotamian creation accounts. Its focus is not cosmological, not how the universe came to be, but anthropological: why humans exist, what they're made of, and what this means for their relationship to the divine. The text opens with the gods divided into two classes: the Anunnaki, great gods, and the Igigi, lesser gods who perform the labour of maintaining the world, digging canals, managing fields, carrying out the physical work of creation. After 40 years of this toil, the Igigi rebel. They burn their tools and surround the house of Enlil, the chief god, demanding relief. The divine council convenes. How can the gods maintain the world without labour? The god Enki, described as wise, proposes a solution: create a new being to take over the work. Not another god, but something lesser, something capable of labour, but not divine. To accomplish this, the gods select one of their own, a god named Geshtu-E, also called We'ila in some versions, whose name is associated with intelligence or consciousness. The text is explicit about what happens next. They slaughtered We'ila, who had intelligence, in their assembly. From his flesh and blood Nintu mixed clay. Nintu, also called Mami or Beletili, the mother goddess, takes this mixture of divine flesh, divine blood, and earthly clay, and forms 14 lumps. 7 become male, 7 female, the first humans. But the text doesn't stop with creation. It explains what the admixture means. From the flesh of the god, the spirit remained. It proclaimed this as his living sign, so that this not be forgotten, the spirit remained. The Sumerian term here, translated as spirit, is itemmu, which can mean ghost, spirit, or essence. What's being described is the embedding of something from Geshtu-E, his intelligence, his consciousness, his essence, into the human form. This isn't metaphorical ensoulment. The text treats it as a material transfer, divine biology mixed with earth. The Enki and Ninmah text, preserved in multiple copies from around 2100 BC, provides another version. Here, Enki and the mother goddess, Ninmah, another name for Ninunaq, create humans to relieve the god's burden. They form the first humans from clay taken from above the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean over which Enki has dominion. But the creation involves more than shaping clay. It requires Ninmah to pinch off clay from the Abzu and mix it with divine substance. After the initial creation succeeds, Enki and Ninmah celebrate with beer. While drunk, they begin a competition. Each tries to create a human with defects, challenging the other to find a use for the flawed being. Ninmah creates 6 defective humans, one with failing eyesight, one unable to hold urine, one with paralysed feet. Enki finds a role for each in society. Then Enki creates Umul, a being so damaged it cannot function. Ninmah cannot find a place for it and concedes defeat. This strange story has troubled interpreters. Why include a drunken divine competition in a creation account? But read procedurally, it makes sense. The text is exploring the parameters of creation, what happens when the mixture isn't right, when the divine proportion is wrong, or the clay is flawed. It's documenting that creation wasn't automatic or perfect. It required knowledge, precision, and repeated attempts. And crucially, both Enki and Ninmah possess this knowledge. Not all gods can create humans. Only those who understand the procedure. Only those with access to the Abzu, the source of the material. Only those who know how to mix divine essence with earthly substance in the right proportions. This brings us to the core implication. If humans were created by mixing divine intelligence with clay, then humans contain that intelligence. It's in their substance, in their blood, in what they pass to offspring. But is it in all humans equally? The texts never quite say. What they do say is that certain humans have special relationships with the gods, that certain bloodlines receive knowledge, others don't. That kingship descends from heaven to specific individuals, not to humanity generally. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, dating to around 1200 BC, but drawing on older traditions, includes a similar creation account. The god Marduk defeats Tiamat, the primordial chaos monster, and uses her body to create the physical universe. Then he turns to creating humanity. From the blood of Kingu, who had once led Tiamat's army, Marduk fashions humans to serve the gods. Again, divine blood as the key ingredient. And again, not just any divine blood, the blood of a being associated with consciousness and will. Kingu had worn the Tablet of Destinies, a symbol of cosmic authority. His blood carries something essential. Now, we should be cautious about reading these accounts too literally. The Mesopotamian creation myths are theology, not biology textbooks. They're explaining humanity's place in the cosmic order, why we labour, why we worship, what our relationship to the divine should be. But they're also doing something else. They're establishing that humanity's capacities, intelligence, consciousness, the ability to understand and manipulate the world come from outside humanity. They're not evolutionary developments in these accounts. They're not learned. They're given physically through mixture. And if capacities are inherited through bloodlines, then knowledge transmission becomes a matter of genealogy. Not everyone has the same proportion of divine essence. Not everyone has the same access to intelligence. Some bloodlines carry more. Some families preserve the highest concentrations of what was originally given. This is precisely what we see in how Sumerian society actually organised itself. Kingship wasn't democratic. Priesthood wasn't open to all. Scribal schools trained the children of existing scribes. Knowledge was hereditary. The creation accounts aren't just explaining why humans exist. They're explaining why certain humans hold authority, why some families rule and others serve, why knowledge passes father to son, mother to daughter in specific lineages. And they're documenting that this system was intentional, that when the gods created humanity, they embedded the possibility of knowledge carriers, that when kingship descended from heaven, it descended to specific individuals prepared by their inheritance to receive it. The texts call these divine gifts the ME. Let's look at what those were and how they were understood to transfer. The ME, portable packages of power. In Sumerian theology, the ME are among the most important and least understood concepts. The word appears frequently in religious and administrative texts, but its precise meaning shifts with context. Sometimes the ME seem to be abstract principles: justice, kingship, music, shepherding. Sometimes they appear as physical objects that can be stolen, transported, or lost. Sometimes they function as powers or capacities that enable certain activities. And sometimes they're described as knowledge itself, the understanding of how things work. The most important texts concerning the ME are the Inanna myths, particularly Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization from Eridu to Uruk. This composition, surviving in multiple copies from around 2000 BC, tells how Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu to visit her father Enki, god of wisdom. Enki welcomes Inanna with a feast. As they drink beer together, Enki becomes drunk and begins giving Inanna the ME, more than 60 of them, according to the text. The list includes lordship, godship, the crown, the throne of kingship, the scepter, the staff, the measuring rod and line, the priestly office, truth, the descent into and ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of prostitution, the art of kissing, weapons, libel, destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, music, eldership, hearership, power, enmity, straightforwardness, treachery, the rebel lands, kindness, justice, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the metalworker, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver, wisdom, attention, sacred prostitution, procession, the tavern, the holy shrine. The list goes on. It encompasses everything from political authority to technical crafts to emotional states to religious functions. After Enki sobers and realizes what he's done, he sends his minister to retrieve the ME from Inanna before she can transport them to Uruk. But Inanna has already loaded them onto her boat of heaven and sailed away. Enki's servants pursue her through 7 stations, attempting to reclaim the ME at each stop, but Inanna successfully defends them. When she arrives in Uruk, she unloads the ME at the temple of Iana, and they become the foundation of her city's prosperity and power. Several aspects of this narrative are significant. First, the ME are portable. They can be physically transferred from one location to another. Inanna loads them onto a boat. She defends them against those who would take them back. When they arrive in Uruk, they're unloaded at a specific temple. Second, the ME are held in Eridu, specifically by Enki in his temple there. Eridu, remember, is where kingship first descended from heaven, where the first antediluvian king Alulim ruled. The connection between Eridu, Enki and the ME is consistent across Sumerian literature. Eridu is the source, the original repository. Third, the ME can be given away, even unintentionally. Enki, drunk, grants them to Inanna. She didn't steal them through force or trickery, though some versions emphasize her seductiveness. She received them as gifts, but once given, they cannot easily be recalled. The transfer is binding. Fourth, the ME are not infinite or universally available. Enki has them. Inanna acquires them. Uruk benefits from having them. But not everyone has them. Cities without the ME lack the capacities they provide. This is why Inanna's transfer of the ME to Uruk is celebrated. It elevates her city above others. In the Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta epic, Preserved in tablets from around 2100 BC, the ME appear again in the context of conflict. Enmerkar, king of Uruk, seeks precious materials from Aratta, a distant mountain city, to build temples. The Lord of Aratta resists, arguing that Aratta holds divine favour and doesn't need to submit to Uruk. The conflict becomes a contest over who has greater access to divine knowledge and power. At one point, Enmerkar speaks of the ME in possessive terms, asserting that Uruk holds them and therefore has authority. The Lord of Aratta counters by invoking his own city's relationship with the goddess Inanna, who seems to be claimed by both cities in different traditions. The epic never fully resolves, but the underlying issue is clear. Possession of the ME determines authority. What exactly are the ME in these texts? The Sumerian term is difficult to translate precisely. It's related to the verb to be and might be rendered as powers, attributes, ordinances, decrees or norms. Some scholars interpret them as cosmic principles that structure reality. Others see them as cultural elements that define civilization. Still, others suggest they're something like Platonic forms, ideal templates that earthly practices imitate. But there's another reading, suggested by how the texts actually describe them being used. The ME might be best understood as knowledge protocols, procedures, technical instructions, the actual information needed to perform the activities they name. The craft of the scribe as AME doesn't mean the abstract concept of writing. It means the specific knowledge of how to write, how to prepare clay, cut a stylus, form characters, organize information, preserve tablets. Knowledge that must be learned and practiced. Kingship as AME doesn't mean the political theory of monarchy. It means the procedures of rule, how to conduct courts, manage administration, perform rituals, maintain legitimacy. Knowledge that must be transmitted from one ruler to the next. In this reading, Inanna's theft of the ME from Eridu means she acquired specific knowledge, craft techniques, ritual procedures, administrative systems that had been concentrated in Eridu and transferred them to Uruk. She didn't steal abstract concepts. She stole the teachers, the texts, the training systems. She stole the library. This interpretation aligns with what we know about actual Sumerian society. Knowledge was held in temples. Scribal schools operated in temple precincts. Craft guilds were attached to temple workshops. Priesthoods maintained specialized knowledge of ritual, astronomy, mathematics, medicine and law, and access to this knowledge was restricted by social class, by family connection, by initiation into specific priesthoods. The ME then might be best understood as the Sumerian term for what we might call protected information, knowledge that wasn't freely available, that required authorization to access, that was held by gatekeepers. And who were those gatekeepers? According to the texts, specific bloodlines, royal families, priestly lineages, scribal dynasties, those whose ancestors had received the knowledge when kingship descended from heaven, and who had maintained it through continuous transmission ever since. This brings us to the procedural core of the system. How did knowledge actually transfer in Sumerian civilization? What institutions existed to preserve and transmit it? What happened when those institutions succeeded, and what happened when they failed? The answer requires understanding what a Sumerian priest-king actually was, not a political title, but a specific role with specific requirements. The priest-king formula. In the archaeological museums of Europe and America, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, the Penn Museum, stand multiple statues of the same man, short, heavy-set, hands clasped in prayer or holding architectural plans, wearing a distinctive cap. Inscriptions on the statue's shoulders and bases identify him, Gudea, Ensi of Lagash. Gudea ruled the city-state of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia around 2120 BCE, during what archaeologists call the Neo-Sumerian period. His reign fell between the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the rise of the Third Dynasty of Ur. He left no conquest inscriptions, no records of military campaigns. Instead, he commissioned more than 20 statues of himself, each with inscriptions describing his temple building activities, and 2 massive clay cylinders covered with over 1,300 lines of cuneiform text detailing the construction of a temple to the god Ningirsu. These Gudea cylinders, housed in the Louvre, are among the longest continuous texts from ancient Sumer. They describe in meticulous detail how Gudea received a dream vision from Ningirsu commanding him to build a temple, how he consulted the goddess Nanshi to interpret the dream, how he purified the city and gathered materials from distant lands, how he supervised every aspect of construction, and how he consecrated the finished temple. The text presents Gudea not primarily as a political ruler, but as a religious intermediary. His title, Ensi, is usually translated as governor or prince, distinguishing him from Lugal, king. But the distinction is more religious than political. An Ensi served the city's god directly, acting as the god's steward. A Lugal might rule multiple cities through conquest, but an Ensi held authority through divine appointment within a single city. Gudea's inscriptions emphasize this relationship constantly. He describes himself as the shepherd called by Ningirsu, the true shepherd of Lagash, beloved of Ningirsu, the man whom Nanshi chose in her heart. His legitimacy derives entirely from divine selection, not from military power, hereditary right, or popular acclaim. But here's what's remarkable. Gudea wasn't from the ruling family of Lagash. The previous dynasty had been overthrown. He came to power during a period of instability, yet his inscriptions never mention how he acquired authority. They simply assert that the gods chose him. And the evidence suggests this was accepted, his reign was peaceful, prosperous, and remembered for centuries after as a golden age. Why would divine selection be sufficient? Because in the Sumerian system, political authority and religious authority were inseparable. You couldn't be an effective ruler unless you could mediate between gods and people, and you couldn't mediate unless you had access to the procedures, the rituals, the divination techniques, the temple protocols, the sacred knowledge. Where did that knowledge come from? According to Gudea's cylinders, from direct divine instruction. But the text also reveals that Gudea wasn't operating alone. He consulted the goddess Nanshi's priestess to interpret his dream. He employed craftsmen who knew how to work precious materials. He used scribes who recorded every detail. He followed protocols for purification, dedication, and consecration. In other words, even when receiving direct divine revelation, Gudea worked within an existing knowledge system. He accessed specialists. He followed procedures transmitted through institutions. His divine appointment activated systems that were already in place, maintained by people who knew how to implement them. The statue inscriptions reinforce this. Many dedicate the statue not to Gudea himself, but to a specific god, with Gudea described as making the offering on behalf of the city. The statues are votive objects, permanent prayers placed in temples to continuously represent Gudea before the divine. This was a standard practice, but Gudea's statues are notable for their quality and quantity. They represent a massive investment of resources in religious infrastructure. What's being preserved in these statues? Not just Gudea's image, but the institutional memory that he fulfilled his role correctly, that he knew how to build temples, conduct rituals, maintain cosmic order. The statues document competence. They prove that the knowledge was properly transmitted through him to the next generation, because that's ultimately what a priest-king did, maintain the system and pass it forward. We see this pattern throughout Sumerian kingship. The king wasn't primarily a military commander or administrator, though he might be those things. He was the link between heaven and earth. His essential function was to ensure the gods remained pleased, the cosmic order held, and the city prospered through divine favour. This required specific knowledge, how to perform the correct rituals at the correct times, how to read omens, how to consecrate temples, how to manage the temple economy, how to maintain the sacred precinct, how to consult the divine through dreams, divination, or oracle. Not everyone could do this. It wasn't a matter of belief or devotion. It required training in techniques that were protected and transmitted through specific channels: temple schools, priestly lineages, royal families. The Ur Namul Stele, excavated at Ur and now in the Penn Museum, illustrates this visually. Though heavily damaged, the surviving fragments show King Ur-Nammu in multiple registers, making offerings to gods, receiving authority from gods, and supervising building projects. The iconography emphasizes his role as intermediary, human scale, but positioned between the divine realm above and the earthly realm below. One fragment shows what appears to be streams of water flowing from above, likely representing the blessing of the gods descending through the king to fertilize the land. This is the priestly king's function visualized, channeling divine power earthward, maintaining the flow of cosmic order into material reality. But channeling requires capacity, a vessel that can hold the power without breaking, a lineage that carries the right proportions of divine essence mixed with earthly clay, a bloodline prepared for the transmission. The texts suggest this preparation happened generationally, that kings raised sons to rule, that priests trained sons in ritual knowledge, that the system preserved itself through families who had held it, in some cases, since kingship first descended from heaven. And when those families failed, when bloodlines ended, when succession broke, when knowledge was lost, the texts record that cities fell into ruin, temples collapsed, and chaos returned, until the line could be restored, until someone from the proper bloodline could re-establish the connection and rebuild the system. This is exactly what we see in the historical record. Cities rise and fall, dynasties come and go, but certain families keep appearing across centuries, holding the same offices, maintaining the same temples, preserving the same knowledge. How did they do it? Through the oldest human technology, teaching their children what their parents taught them. Let's look at how that transmission actually worked. From father to son, the Shuruppak instructions. Among the oldest surviving literary texts in human history is a Sumerian composition called the Instructions of Shuruppak. Multiple copies exist, found at various sites across ancient Iraq, ranging in date from approximately 2600 BCE to 1800 BCE, a span of 800 years during which this text was continuously copied, taught, and preserved. The text is framed as advice given by a father named Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra. As we've seen, these are not random names. Shuruppak or Ubaratur is the 8th and final antediluvian king on the Sumerian king list. Ziusudra is the flood survivor, the bridge between pre-flood and post-flood civilization. The instructions begin, in those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years. In those far remote years, in ancient times, after what was needed had become manifest, after what was needed had been taken care of properly, after bread had been eaten in the sanctuaries of the land, after the ovens of the land had been fired up, after heaven had been moved away from earth, after earth had been separated from heaven, after mankind had been established, Shuruppak gave advice to his son. Shuruppak, the son of Ubara-Tutu, gave advice to his son Ziusudra. My son, let me give you advice. May you pay attention. Ziusudra, let me speak a word to you. May you listen carefully. The opening formula is significant. It places the advice in far remote days, in the time after mankind had been established, but before ordinary history begins. This is the liminal time, after creation, but before the current order. And in that time, a father passes knowledge to a son across the generational boundary. The advice itself is practical, even mundane. Do not set up your house at the main street. Do not vouch for someone, or he will have a hold on you. Do not loiter about where there is a quarrel, for that is what quarrels produce. Do not place yourself in a city whose activities are inimical. Do not buy a donkey that brays, it will split your eardrum. Do not commit rape upon anyone's daughter. A female innkeeper should not speak ill of you in the city squares. A merchant should not say bad things about you in the street. Do not beat a farmer's son, he will make you pay for it. You should not start a quarrel with anyone. If you do, people's hearts will be sore. One day is a lion, another day is a wolf. My son, you should not steal anything. You should not murder. You should not commit fraud. You should not give orders to a city ruler. Do not make your wife have sex by force. Let the fire not be extinguished in your house. A loving heart builds the house. A hateful heart destroys the house. Power should bow to truth. On and on, for over 280 lines in the fullest versions. How to choose a wife. How to treat slaves. How to manage property. How to speak to authorities. How to navigate society without making powerful enemies. How to build a household that will endure. This is not sacred scripture. It's not myth or ritual instruction. It's social wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of how to survive and prosper in a complex civilization where one misstep could destroy you. But why attribute this to Shuruppak? Why frame these eminently practical teachings as coming from an antediluvian king? Why preserve them for 800 years with such care? Because they represent the knowledge that survived, the wisdom that crossed the flood, the instructions that, if followed, would allow civilization to rebuild and endure. The text ends with a colophon in some versions, identifying the scribe who copied it and the date. These colophons reveal that the instructions of Shuruppak were used as teaching texts in scribal schools. Student scribes copied them as exercises, learning both the content and the skill of writing simultaneously. So we have a text attributed to a pre-flood father instructing his son, preserved continuously for centuries, used to train each new generation of scribes, emphasizing intergenerational knowledge transfer as the foundation of civilized life. The pattern is clear. Knowledge doesn't arise spontaneously in each generation. It must be taught. And the teaching happens within families, from parent to child, through deliberate transmission. Other Sumerian wisdom texts reinforce this structure. The farmer's instructions is framed as a father teaching his son agricultural techniques. The instructions of Ninurta presents a king advising his son on governance. Multiple father-to-son compositions survive, all using the same frame. An elder who knows, instructing a younger person who must learn. This wasn't just literary convention. It reflected how Sumerian society actually transmitted specialized knowledge. Crafts passed from father to son, priesthoods maintained family continuity, scribal schools trained the children of existing scribes. Royal families raised princes to rule. And crucially, these transmissions weren't just of technique, they were of eligibility. A son didn't just learn carpentry from his carpenter father, he gained the right to practice carpentry. A prince didn't just learn kingship, he inherited the capacity to hold it. The system was closed. Not everyone could access every kind of knowledge. Not everyone had the genealogical credentials to hold certain offices. Bloodline determined possibility. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty or social stratification for its own sake, though it certainly created hierarchy. It reflected a belief that knowledge transmission required prepared receivers, that not everyone could hold certain kinds of information, that maintaining the integrity of knowledge across generations required restricting access to those whose inheritance prepared them to understand it. The instructions of Shuruppak literalizes this principle by attributing social wisdom to a father from before the flood, teaching his son how to preserve civilization after it. The text is saying this is how knowledge survives catastrophe, through fathers who teach sons, who teach sons, who teach sons, across thousands of years, maintaining continuity. But fathers and sons aren't the only transmission channel. Sumerian society also used daughters in very specific ways for very specific purposes. Let's examine the role of royal women in the knowledge system. Royal daughters as knowledge anchors. In the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum sits a small calcite disc, approximately 9 inches in diameter, carved in relief with an image of a woman wearing the distinctive horned crown of divinity. Behind her stands an attendant. Before her, a step platform rises. An inscription runs across the back of the disc and around its edge. Enheduanna, Ziru priestess, wife of the god Nanna, daughter of Sargon, king of the world, in the temple of the goddess Inanna in Ur, built an altar and named it Altar, platform of heaven. This disc, dated to approximately 2300 BC, documents one of the most significant figures in ancient Mesopotamian religion, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, appointed as priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. Sargon of Akkad conquered Sumer around 2334 BC, unifying the city-states under the world's first empire. He faced a political problem, how to govern cities with their own gods, their own priesthoods, their own traditions. Military conquest could seize cities, but it couldn't automatically grant religious legitimacy. The gods of each city needed to recognize the new ruler, and that recognition came through the priesthoods. Sargon's solution was to appoint his daughter Enheduanna as priestess at Ur, one of Sumer's holiest cities. The priestess held the highest religious office in the city, second only to the king himself. She was considered the earthly spouse of the city's god, the intermediary through whom divine will was communicated. This wasn't a political appointment in the way we'd understand it. Enheduanna underwent ritual marriage to Nanna. She lived in the temple precinct. She composed hymns and prayers that were used in temple services. She oversaw religious festivals. She managed the temple's economic holdings. And most importantly, she provided continuity, a permanent religious presence, even as political administrations changed. Enheduanna is historically significant for another reason. She is the first author known by name in human history. Several hymns and poems are explicitly attributed to her, including the exaltation of Inanna and the temple hymns. These compositions survived and were copied for centuries after her death, becoming part of the standard Sumerian literary curriculum. But for our purposes, what matters is the pattern she represents. Sargon didn't send a general to govern Ur. He sent his daughter to hold the highest priesthood. He anchored his dynasty's legitimacy through bloodline and ritual office combined. This practice didn't originate with Sargon. The appointment of royal daughters as priestesses appears much earlier in Sumerian history. The Tumul inscription, a text preserved in 16 copies found at Nippur and Ur, chronicles the maintenance of a temple called the Tumul, dedicated to the goddess Ninlil at Nippur. The text repeatedly uses the formula, brought the Tumul to good order, brought Ninlil into the Tumul. His daughter's name was made priestess of Inanna. This pattern appears for multiple kings across several dynasties. Each king restores the Tumul temple. Each king ensures his daughter becomes priestess. The daughter's appointment is treated as equivalent in importance to the temple's restoration. It's part of maintaining cosmic order. Why daughters? Why not sons? Sons inherited political authority. They became the next king. But daughters could form permanent connections with a city's divine structure without threatening dynastic succession. A daughter didn't compete for the throne. She anchored the family's religious legitimacy while her brother held political power. And crucially, daughters linked bloodlines. When Sargon's daughter Enheduanna became priestess at Ur, she connected Sargon's Akkadian dynasty to Ur's ancient Sumerian religious traditions. She was both Akkadian by birth, Sumerian by office. Her bloodline made her eligible for the role, and the role made Akkadian rule acceptable to Sumerian gods. This pattern continues throughout Mesopotamian history. The daughters of Hammurabi, Nabonidus, and other kings are appointed to high priesthoods. The office of priestess at Ur continues for over 500 years after Enheduanna, always held by a royal daughter. But there's another dimension. These women weren't just placeholders. The evidence suggests they were highly educated, trained in temple procedures, skilled in ritual practice, and in Enheduanna's case, accomplished poets. They held real knowledge, not symbolic status. The temple hymns attributed to Enheduanna catalogues 42 temples across Sumer and Akkad, describing each one's architecture, deity, and significance. This represents encyclopedic knowledge of Mesopotamian religion, the kind of knowledge that would take years of study to acquire. It also represents political knowledge, which cities matter, which gods require attention, how the religious landscape structures power. When Enheduanna composed hymns that were then used in temple services for centuries, she was actively shaping Mesopotamian religion. Her theological innovations, particularly her elevation of Inanna to supremacy over other deities, became orthodox. Her poetry preserved and transmitted religious knowledge to subsequent generations. So royal daughters served multiple functions in the knowledge transmission system. First, they anchored dynasties religiously. A king might be foreign, might have seized power through violence, might lack clear hereditary claim. But if his daughter held the priestess office, the gods recognized his authority. Second, they provided continuity across political transitions. Kings died, dynasties fell. But the priestess might serve for decades, outlasting multiple political regimes, maintaining the temple's operations regardless of who controlled the palace. Third, they preserved and transmitted religious knowledge. As priestesses, they trained in ritual procedures, learned the sacred texts, mastered divination and interpretation. This knowledge passed through them to the next generation of priests and priestesses. Fourth, they linked bloodlines to knowledge. Not everyone could become priestess. The office required royal blood. Why? Because the role required capacity, the ability to mediate between divine and human realms. And that capacity, the text suggests, was hereditary. This raises an uncomfortable question for modern sensibilities. Was knowledge access in Sumerian civilization genuinely restricted by bloodline? Did they actually believe some families were inherently more capable of holding certain kinds of information? The evidence suggests yes, not because of crude biological determinism, but because of how they understood human creation. If humanity was made by mixing divine intelligence with earthly clay, and if that mixture varied, if some bloodlines carried higher proportions of divine essence, then some families would be better equipped to handle divine knowledge. This isn't how we think about human capacity. We believe in universal potential, equality of opportunity, knowledge open to all who seek it. The Sumerian system operated on different assumptions. Knowledge is dangerous, not everyone can safely hold it, transmission requires prepared vessels. Whether those assumptions were true is separate from whether the Sumerians believed them and organised society accordingly. The evidence that they did is everywhere, in royal inscriptions tracing genealogy, in priesthood succession rules, in craft guild restrictions, and most clearly in the scribal schools. Let's examine how those schools worked, because they're where knowledge transmission became most systematic and most restricted. The scribal bloodline, tablet house dynasties. In the ruins of ancient Nippur, archaeologists excavating in the 1950s uncovered an unusual building. Unlike the grand temples and palaces that dominated Mesopotamian cities, this structure was modest, a house-sized building with several rooms. But inside, the excavators found something extraordinary: over 4,100 cuneiform tablets, most of them school texts. clay tablets covered with student exercises, practice signs, multiplication tables, grammatical paradigms, literary extracts and model contracts. The excavators called it House F. Scholars now call it the most complete example of an Eduba ever discovered, a scribal school, literally tablet house in Sumerian, where young men were trained in the complex art of cuneiform writing. The tablets found in House F tell us exactly how scribal education worked. The curriculum began with basic sign formation. Students practiced drawing wedges with a stylus in wet clay, learning the correct angle and pressure. They copied elementary sign lists, memorizing the cuneiform signs for numbers, objects, and common words. Once they mastered basic signs, students progressed to syllabaries, lists showing how signs combined to represent sounds, then to vocabulary lists, bilingual Sumerian Akkadian glossaries of thousands of words organized by category, trees, fish, birds, stones, professions, parts of the body. Then to model legal contracts, showing the standard formulas for sales, adoptions, marriages, and loans. Then to literary compositions, the myths, hymns, and proverbs that formed Sumerian cultural memory. The entire curriculum took years. A successful graduate would be able to read and write both Sumerian and Akkadian, calculate complex mathematical problems, draft legal documents, copy literary texts accurately, and understand the religious and cultural context that informed everything the literate class did. Literacy was power in Mesopotamian civilization. Scribes didn't just copy texts, they managed temple economies, recording offerings, tracking labour, distributing rations. They drafted royal inscriptions, they preserved treaty terms, they maintained the legal records that defined property ownership and social obligations. They trained the next generation. Without scribes, the entire administrative apparatus of civilization would collapse. So who could become a scribe? The evidence from House F and other scribal schools is clear. Scribes trained their own sons. The tablets include colophons identifying the student who wrote them. When archaeologists analysed these names, they found family connections. Multiple tablets by students with the same patronymic, brothers, cousins, generations of the same families studying in the same schools. We also have administrative texts listing scribal families by name, generation after generation, holding scribal positions. The scribal profession was hereditary. A boy became a scribe because his father was a scribe. He learned in a school run by scribes. He was taught by scribes. He copied texts preserved by scribal families, and when he graduated, he joined the scribal guild and eventually trained his own son. This wasn't absolute. We have evidence of a few individuals from non-scribal families entering the profession, usually through temple service or royal patronage. But they were exceptions. The norm was dynastic. Scribal knowledge passed within bloodlines. Why? Partly for practical reasons. Training a scribe required years of intensive education. A family already embedded in scribal culture could start teaching children young, using the father's own archive of tablets as teaching materials. They had economic incentive to train sons to take over family positions. But there were also ideological reasons. A composition called the Scribal School, preserved in multiple copies from around 2000 BC, describes the daily life of a student. It includes this exchange. The schoolmaster said to me, "Why did you come late?" I was afraid. My heart beat fast. I entered before my teacher and made a respectful salutation. My teacher read my tablet and said, "Your handwriting is good." The assistant teachers praised me. The father of the tablet house said to me, "Where did you go?" I said, "I did not go anywhere." He said, "Why did you idle about? Go to your father's house and tell him you need beer." The text is satirical, poking fun at the pretensions and petty cruelties of school life. But notice the detail. The student's father is involved. He provides beer to the teachers. The relationship between school and family is direct. Another scribal text, the praise of the scribal art, makes the hereditary nature explicit. The scribe, the son of a scribe, the heir of his father's wisdom. His hand is clever at the craft learned from his father. The scribal art is the father's treasure, passed to the son who deserves it. The one who has learned the craft from his father sits in the assembly of the wise. The one who has not learned cannot sit there. Knowledge as father's treasure, craft as inheritance, eligibility determined by family connection. This wasn't just description, it was ideology. The scribal class believed their knowledge was properly theirs to guard and transmit. And this wasn't limited to basic scribes. The highest levels of scholarly knowledge, astronomical calculations, medical diagnoses, divination rituals, temple architecture, legal precedent, were held by specialist scribes who formed their own dynasties. We have texts identifying families who maintained expertise in particular areas across multiple generations. The most striking example comes from the later Neo-Babylonian period, 7th-6th centuries, when we have detailed records of scholarly families at Uruk and Babylon. These families possess private libraries of specialized texts, curated and copied within the family, with knowledge passing from father to son or uncle to nephew. The great astronomer scribes of Babylon, who developed the mathematical astronomy that influenced Greek and later Islamic science, came from a small number of families who held this knowledge for centuries. In earlier Sumerian and Old Babylonian periods, we see the same pattern. Certain families held priestly offices generation after generation. Certain families provided temple administrators. Certain families trained as diviners or healers. Why does this matter for understanding the Sumerian king list and its claims about bloodline and knowledge? Because it shows that the Sumerians actually organised their knowledge transmission systems around heredity. It wasn't just kings who passed authority through bloodlines. It was everyone who held specialised knowledge, priests, scribes, craftsmen, administrators. The scribal schools were the institutional mechanism that made this work. They preserved texts across generations. They trained each new cohort in the standardised curriculum. They maintained quality control through rigorous copying exercises. And they did all this within family structures that ensured continuity. When the king list claims kingship descended from heaven to specific individuals, when it traces lineages back to antediluvian rulers, when it emphasises succession through family lines, it's operating within a culture that genuinely believed knowledge passes through bloodlines and institutions, exist to protect that transmission. The tablets tell us this directly. They document it in student exercises, in colophons naming fathers and sons, in curriculum texts that have been copied continuously for centuries. The scribal school was a knowledge transmission machine, and it ran on heredity, but schools and families weren't enough by themselves. The system also needed visible proof. It needed monuments demonstrating that the right people held the right knowledge and maintained the right relationships with the divine. Let's look at how rulers proved their legitimacy through stone and clay. Divine legitimacy in stone. In the Penn Museum's Mesopotamian gallery stands a fragmented limestone stele, reassembled from dozens of pieces. Even damaged, it towers over visitors. The original stood perhaps 11 feet tall. Carved in multiple registers, it depicts King Unamu in various poses, receiving authority from seated gods, pouring libations, supervising building projects. The stele dates to around 2100 B, commissioned by Unamu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur. What's striking isn't the king's depiction. Mesopotamian royal monuments frequently show kings in divine presence, but how insistently the iconography emphasises his divine appointment. In the surviving upper registers, gods literally place symbols of authority in Ur-Nammu's hands. In lower registers, the king pours offerings before seated deities. The compositional structure presents a clear message. This ruler's authority flows directly from divine will. But Ur-Nammu wasn't the heir of the previous dynasty. He came to power after a period of instability following the collapse of Akkadian rule. He had no obvious hereditary claim to kingship. So why do the gods recognize him? The inscription provides the answer. Carved along the stay's frame it reads, Unamu, the mighty warrior, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, he for whom An and Enlil, from among all the people, determined an eternal kingdom, from where the sun rises to where it sets, he who established justice in the land, from among all the people, determined an eternal kingdom, not elected, not seized by conquest, determined by the gods, selected from humanity generally, but selected because he met criteria the gods recognized. What were those criteria? The text doesn't explicitly say, but other royal inscriptions provide clues. Kings routinely describe themselves with genealogical formulas, son of Arthur's name, descendant of Olmesek, tracing lineage back as many generations as records allowed. Even usurpers who lacked royal parentage found ways to claim connection to earlier dynasties through marriage or adoption. The concern with bloodline wasn't just political legitimacy, it was theological. The gods work through specific families, divine favour attached to certain lineages. If you wanted the gods to recognise your rule, you needed to demonstrate you came from a line they'd recognised before. Ur-Nammu's stele, though it doesn't explicitly trace his genealogy, establishes his legitimacy through iconography. The gods physically give him authority. He performs the correct rituals. He builds and rebuilds temples. He maintains cosmic order. The stele is proof that he knows how to fulfill the role. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian royal art. The stele of Hammurabi, now in the Louvre, shows the king receiving the law code from the sun god Shamash. The victory stele of Naram Sin depicts the king ascending a mountain, while stars represent shine above. Boundary stones called Kudurus show gods granting land rights to kings. Every major royal monument includes divine presence, divine authorization, divine connection. Why was this necessary? Partly for propaganda, convincing subjects that rebellion would mean defying the gods. But the consistency and elaboration of the iconography suggests something deeper. The kings themselves believed it. They understood their authority as genuinely dependent on divine recognition, and they understood that recognition required proper relationship with divine powers. That relationship was mediated through bloodline and ritual knowledge combined. A king needed both ancestry that made him eligible and training in procedures that made him effective. The Gudea statues illustrate this perfectly. 20+ statues, all showing the same man in the same poses, all carefully inscribed with dedications to gods and descriptions of his temple building. Why so many? Because each statue served as a permanent representative of Gudea in a temple, continuously offering prayers on his behalf. The statues prove Gudea knew the correct procedures and could afford the massive investment required. They demonstrate competence. Several Gudea statues show him holding architectural plans, literally carved representations of building layouts on his lap. One statue's inscription explains he consulted with the goddess Nanshe about the plans shown to him in his dream. He made them a reality in the city. The king as architect, working from divine blueprint, implementing heaven's design on earth. This is what divine legitimacy looked like in practice. Not just claiming the gods approved you, but demonstrating you could do what the gods required. And that demonstration required knowledge, how to build temples correctly, how to perform rituals properly, how to maintain the economic and social systems that supported religious infrastructure. Where did that knowledge come from? From training in families who held it, from priests who taught procedures, from scribes who copied texts, from craftsmen who knew techniques. The king stood at the centre of this knowledge network, channeling it into visible proof that the system still worked. When succession worked smoothly, when a trained son inherited from a knowledgeable father, when priesthoods maintained continuity, when scribal schools kept teaching, the visible evidence accumulated. More temples built, more monuments erected, more inscriptions carved. The landscape filled with proof that knowledge was being properly transmitted and applied. But when succession failed, when dynasties ended without heirs, when conquest disrupted priesthoods, when cities were destroyed, the proof disappeared. Temples fell into ruin. Knowledge was lost. And the texts record this as catastrophe. Let's look at what happened when the system broke down. When the system failed, collapse and restoration. The Tamil inscription, preserved in 16 copies from Nippur and is one of the strangest texts in the Sumerian corpus. It reads like a chronicle, documenting the maintenance of a single temple complex over multiple dynasties. But its structure is repetitive, almost liturgical. Enmebaragesi, who brought the tribute of Elam, became king. He brought the Tamil to splendour. Aga, son of Enmebaragesi, made the Tamil magnificent. Then the Tamil fell into ruins for the first time. Mesenepada, king of Ur, brought the Tamil to splendour. Meskiagnana, son of Mesenepada, brought Ninlil to the Tamil and made the Tamil magnificent. Then the Tamil fell into ruins for the second time. Gilgamesh built the wall of Uruk. Ur-Lugal, son of Gilgamesh, brought the Tamil to splendour. Ur-Nungal, son of Ur-Lugal, made the Tamil magnificent. Then the Tamil fell into ruins for the third time. The pattern continues through 5 cycles. A king rebuilds the Tamil, his son maintains it, then it falls into ruins. Another dynasty rises, rebuilds, and the cycle repeats. What is this text documenting? On the surface, the physical maintenance of a temple, but the repetition suggests something deeper. Each time the Tamil is restored, civilization functions. Each time it falls to ruin, we're left with the implication that the system collapsed. The Tamil wasn't just any temple. It was dedicated to Ninlil at Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer. Nippur held special status. It was never a political capital, but every king sought to control it, because controlling Nippur meant controlling Sumerian religious legitimacy. The Tamil was where the god's authority was physically anchored on earth. When the text says it fell into ruins, it might mean literal destruction, walls collapsing, roof caving in, rituals ceasing. But it might also mean institutional collapse. The priests who knew the procedures died or fled. The knowledge of how to maintain it was lost. The lineages that served it ended. Either way, the restoration required someone who knew how to rebuild it, someone who understood the proper procedures, someone the gods would recognize. And the text emphasizes that restoration came from established dynasties, Enmebaragesi of Kish, Mesenepada of Ur, Gilgamesh of Uruk, kings whose legitimacy was already established, who had access to the knowledge required. This pattern, collapse and restoration by legitimate dynasties, appears throughout Mesopotamian history. The Sumerian king list documents it systematically. After listing the first dynasty of Kish, it notes, then Kish was defeated and the kingship was taken to Eanna. After the first dynasty of Uruk, Uruk was defeated and the kingship was taken to Ur. Dynasty after dynasty rises, falls, and is succeeded by another city's ruling family. But notice what doesn't happen. Kingship doesn't disappear. It relocates. It transfers from one legitimate holder to another. The system persists even when individual dynasties fail, except when it doesn't. The king list records several moments when the system genuinely broke. The most dramatic is the Gutian period. After the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BC, mountain tribes called the Gutians invaded southern Mesopotamia. The king list describes their rule with disgust. The kingdom was brought by force to Gutium. In Gutium, at first no king was famous. They ruled their own selves. They had no king for 3 years. Then it lists a series of Gutian rulers with non-Mesopotamian names and irregular reigns. Finally, then Gutium was defeated and the kingship was taken to Uruk. What's significant is the phrase, no king was famous, and they ruled their own selves. This suggests The Gutians didn't understand how Mesopotamian kingship worked. They seized political power but couldn't access the religious legitimacy that made power sustainable. They couldn't maintain the temples properly. They couldn't perform the rituals. They lacked the knowledge embedded in the bloodlines they displaced. Sumerian literature from shortly after this period is filled with laments. The lamentation over Sumer and Ur describes cities destroyed, temples abandoned, gods departed. The temple of Enlil has been given over to the wind. Ekur, the mountain house, has been destroyed. The sacred women have been carried off by boat. The righteous man has been seized by the foreigner. The judgment halls have been filled with slander. The assembly places have become places of lamentation. The text doesn't just mourn physical destruction, it mourns institutional collapse. The righteous, those who knew how to maintain order, are gone. The judgment halls, where law was administered, no longer function. The sacred women, priestesses maintaining ritual continuity, have been taken away. Knowledge was disrupted, lineages were broken, and the result is described as cosmic catastrophe, not just political defeat. The restoration comes when Utu-Hegel of Uruk defeats the Gutians and Re establishes Sumerian rule, followed by Ur-Nammu founding the third dynasty of Ur. And how do they restore order? By rebuilding temples, reinstating priesthoods, reviving scribal schools, and reconnecting with the traditions held by the families who had maintained them. Ur-Nammu's law code, the oldest substantial law code we possess, begins when An and Enlil had given the kingship of Ur to Nanna. At that time did Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, by the might of Nanna, lord of the city, establish equity in the land. He banished malediction, violence and strife, and set the monthly temple expenses at 90 gur of barley, 30 sheep, and 30 silla of butter. The code doesn't start with legal principles. It starts with divine authorization, then immediately addresses temple maintenance. The priority is clear. Restore the religious system first, then civil order follows. This is the pattern whenever the system failed and was restored. Legitimate rulers, those recognized by the gods, those from families with the knowledge, rebuilt the infrastructure, reinstated the rituals, trained new priests and scribes, and reconnected the broken lineages. But what if the restoration never came? What if knowledge was lost permanently? The archaeological record shows this happened. Certain Sumerian religious texts stopped being copied after specific dates. Certain temples were never rebuilt. Certain cities never recovered. When lineages ended without successors, when key knowledge holders died without teaching replacements, when catastrophic destruction was too complete, restoration failed. The Sumerians themselves feared this. Multiple texts invoke curses against those who would damage temples or interrupt priesthoods. Whoever removes this inscription, may Nanna afflict his city with famine. May his line end. May his name be forgotten. Why such dramatic curses? Because removing an inscription didn't just erase a king's memory. It could disrupt the chain of knowledge. If future generations couldn't read who built a temple and how, they might not know how to maintain it. The inscription preserved procedure. The system worked when bloodlines remained intact, when knowledge passed smoothly, when institutions maintained continuity. It failed when those chains broke. And the evidence of failure wasn't just political, it was visible in ruined temples, silent cult centres, abandoned cities where knowledge died with its last keeper. Mesopotamian civilization did eventually end. The last cuneiform tablet dates to 75 C. By then, centuries of conquest, cultural change and religious transformation had severed the knowledge chains. No one remembered how to read cuneiform. The temple schools closed. The scribal families died out or converted to new traditions. The knowledge guarded for 3,000 years was lost. But while it lasted, the system worked precisely because it was hereditary. because families invested in transmitting knowledge to their children, because priesthoods maintained continuity, because rulers proved their legitimacy by demonstrating competence learned from predecessors. Now we need to step back and ask, what does this all mean? How should we interpret this pattern? What are the competing explanations? 3 readings of the pattern. We've examined the evidence. The Sumerian king list with its impossible antediluvian reigns. The flood survivor who preserves knowledge across catastrophe. The creation accounts mixing divine intelligence with human form. The ME as transferable packages of knowledge. The priest kings as intermediaries requiring both bloodline and training. The father-to-son wisdom texts. The royal daughters anchoring dynasties through priesthood. The scribal schools restricting access by family. The monuments proving divine legitimacy through procedural competence. The collapse and restoration cycles where knowledge chains broke and were repaired. How do we make sense of this? What was actually happening? There are 3 main interpretations, each with strengths and problems. Reading 1. Pure mythology. The first interpretation, held by many scholars, is that the Sumerian texts describing bloodline-based knowledge transmission are mythological justifications for social hierarchy. In this view, the Sumerians invented these stories to legitimize inequality. Kings claimed divine descent to justify their power. Priests restricted knowledge to maintain their privileges. Scribes kept literacy exclusive to preserve their economic niche. The antediluvian kings, with their impossible reign lengths, are legends, the product of mythological thinking that hadn't yet learned to distinguish fantasy from history. The flood narrative is cultural memory of a localized disaster elaborated into cosmic mythology. The ME are abstract concepts personified as objects because Sumerian thought operated symbolically rather than analytically. The social system, hereditary kingship, dynastic priesthood, restricted literacy wasn't based on genuine belief that knowledge required special bloodlines. It was based on power. Those who had knowledge restricted it to maintain advantage. The ideology of blood-based eligibility was propaganda, a story the elite told to keep the masses compliant. This interpretation's strength is that it explains Sumerian society using frameworks we understand. Elite capture of knowledge happens in every civilization. Hereditary privilege is a common form of social organization. Mythological legitimation of power is universal. But this reading struggles with the evidence's specificity. If these were just self-serving stories, why are they so procedurally detailed? Why do the texts document actual institutions, scribal schools, temple priesthoods, craft guilds that demonstrably did restrict knowledge by bloodline? Why were these texts copied for centuries after the political context that generated them had vanished? And most challenging for this interpretation, why do the Sumerians themselves seem to have believed it? The texts aren't cynical, they're earnest. They present bloodline-based knowledge transmission not as propaganda, but as description, as the way things obviously work, as the system that must be maintained for civilization to continue. Reading 2. Encoded wisdom. The second interpretation treats the bloodline narratives as symbolic encoding of spiritual or philosophical knowledge. In this view, bloodline means lineage of understanding, not biological descent. The antediluvian kings with their vast reigns represent stages of consciousness evolution. The ME are not physical objects, but states of awareness. The flood is not a historical event, but a metaphor for spiritual crisis and renewal. When texts say knowledge passes from father to son, they mean teacher to student. When they restrict priesthood by family, they're describing initiation into mystery traditions. The apparent biological determinism is actually coding, protecting esoteric knowledge by disguising it as hereditary privilege, so casual readers won't recognize what's being transmitted. This interpretation appears in alternative history literature, particularly in works attempting to read ancient texts as encoded scientific or spiritual knowledge. Enki becomes a symbol of human enlightenment. The Anunnaki represent higher dimensional beings or stages of consciousness. The mixing of divine blood with clay represents the awakening of human spiritual capacity. The strength of this reading is that it preserves the text's meaningfulness while avoiding literal impossibilities. It allows us to see Sumerian religion as sophisticated philosophy rather than primitive superstition. It credits the Sumerians with intentional symbolic depth, but this interpretation faces serious problems. First, it requires importing interpretive frameworks foreign to Mesopotamian culture. The Sumerians didn't write in symbol codes the way later mystery traditions might have. Cuneiform is remarkably literal. Its vocabulary of concrete nouns, specific verbs, and detailed procedures doesn't suggest hidden metaphysics. Second, we can check many of these claims against reality. When texts say scribal schools trained scribes' sons, we can excavate scribal schools and verify that scribal families really did dominate the profession. When texts say the emprestess must be the king's daughter, we can check royal inscriptions and confirm that emprestesses were indeed royal daughters. The system described in the texts was the actual social system, not an allegory. Third, this reading doesn't explain why bloodline mattered so consistently across so many contexts, not just religious offices, but craft guilds, administrative positions, property inheritance. If bloodline just meant trained successor, why use genealogical language so insistently? Reading 3. Knowledge inheritance as historical reality. The third interpretation takes the text more nearly at face value. The Sumerians organised their knowledge transmission around bloodlines because they genuinely believed certain capacities were hereditary, and they built institutions to protect and transmit knowledge through families across generations. This doesn't require accepting the literal truth of 40,000-year reigns or gods physically mixing blood with clay. It means accepting that the Sumerians believed human capacity varied, that this variation had something to do with ancestry, and that preserving knowledge across time required restricting access to those whose inheritance prepared them to hold it. In this reading, the antediluvian section of the King List preserves institutional memory of an earlier knowledge system, whether pre-flood in a literal sense or simply ancient in the way cultures develop origin myths about their founding. The enormous time spans might measure something other than individual lifespans, institutional continuity, dynastic tenure, cycles of knowledge preservation. The flood represents a genuine disruption, whether the archaeological flood layer dated to 2900 BCE or the broader collapse of early urban civilization that archaeology documents between the Uruk period and early dynastic periods. Ziusudra represents the survival of knowledge through catastrophe, carried forward by one line that maintained continuity. The ME are the Sumerian conceptual category for knowledge protocols, the actual procedures, techniques, rituals and crafts that civilization required. They're treated as semi-material because knowledge was embedded in physical object splits, tools, temple architecture, and in trained practitioners, priests, craftsmen. When Inanna steals the ME from Eridu, she's acquiring actual knowledge, either texts, teachers, or craft specialists that she brings to Uruk. The hereditary restriction of knowledge wasn't arbitrary oppression. It reflected a belief, based on their creation theology, that capacity varied by bloodline. If humans were created by mixing divine intelligence with clay, and if that mixture varied, then some families carried higher concentrations of divine capacity. Those families became knowledge keepers. Whether this belief was accurate is separate from whether it shaped how Sumerians organised society. The evidence shows they organised society exactly as the belief would predict: knowledge held by families, transmitted parent to child, protected through institutional continuity, with catastrophic results when the chains broke. The strength of this reading is that it explains why the system worked as long as it did. Hereditary knowledge transmission can be very effective. Families invest heavily in training children to master specialized knowledge. Continuity across generations allows cumulative refinement. Restriction protects knowledge from degradation through mass transmission. The modern university system, despite its rhetoric of open access, actually operates on similar principles. Academic families produce disproportionate numbers of academics. Graduate students become apprenticed to specific professors, learning not just subject matter, but professional practice. Specialized knowledge remains concentrated in institutions that carefully control access through credentialing. The weakness is that this reading requires us to accept that the Sumerians might have understood something about knowledge transmission that we've lost. That restricting knowledge, which we consider unethical, might have been their mechanism for preserving it. That bloodline-based access, which we reject as discriminatory, was their solution to the problem of maintaining technical knowledge across civilizational timescales. Which reading is correct? The honest answer is, we can't be certain. The texts are 4,000 years old. The culture that produced them is extinct. We're interpreting fragmentary evidence through the lens of our own assumptions about how knowledge, society, and human capacity work. What we can say is this: the Sumerian texts consistently present knowledge transmission as requiring bloodline continuity. They built institutions around this principle. Those institutions successfully preserved technical, religious, and administrative knowledge for over 2,000 years, longer than any modern institution has existed. Whether they were right to believe bloodline mattered, or whether their system worked despite that belief rather than because of it, the system did work. Knowledge was preserved. Cuneiform was taught for 3 millennia. Temple procedures continued for centuries. Legal traditions persisted. And when the chains broke, when bloodlines ended, when schools closed, when priesthoods failed, knowledge died with them. What remains is the question the texts pose to us. If you wanted to preserve knowledge across thousands of years, across wars and floods and civilizational collapses, how would you do it? The Sumerian answer was, embed it in families, make it hereditary, build institutions to protect the transmission, guard the bloodlines that carry it. It worked until it didn't, until conquest and cultural change severed the chains irreparably. Now those texts sit in museum vaults, records of a system we can barely comprehend, posing questions about knowledge, inheritance, and memory we haven't fully answered. Let's consider what those questions mean. The keepers and the kept. The clay prism rests in its housing in Oxford. The curator's hands, gloved, replace the lid. The climate control hums. The vault door closes. 4,000 years ago, a scribe in the city of Ur pressed wedges into wet clay, recording a king list his predecessors had compiled from older records. He listed 8 kings before the flood, their names, their cities, their impossibly long reigns. He recorded the flood. He continued with kings after their gradually decreasing reigns. He wrote out dynasty after dynasty, city after city, until he reached his own time, the 3rd dynasty of Ur, when Ibbi-Sin ruled. The scribe was performing his function in the knowledge transmission system. He was copying a text that preserved institutional memory. He was learning the scribal craft his father had taught him. He was maintaining the chain. He couldn't have known that less than a century after he wrote, Ur would fall to Elamite invasion. The 3rd dynasty would end. The scribal schools would close. The texts would be buried in ruins. The continuous chain of Sumerian literacy would break. But the tablet survived. It was copied again, centuries later, by scribes in other cities who still read Sumerian. And those copies survived, buried in destruction layers, until archaeologists excavated them in the 20th century, and museums preserved them, and scholars learned to read them again. So in a sense, the chain never fully broke. The knowledge survived. though not in the bloodlines, not in the families, not in the living transmission. It survived in clay, in the medium itself, in the information physically encoded into material that outlasted the civilization that created it. What does this tell us about knowledge and memory, about how information persists across time, about what it means to be a keeper of knowledge? The Sumerians believed knowledge required specific bloodlines because they understood transmission as an active process requiring trained practitioners. You couldn't just write down knowledge and expect it to survive. The texts needed scribes who could read them. The rituals needed priests who could perform them. The crafts needed artisans who could practice them. Knowledge was embedded in people, in institutions, in living practice, and they were right. When the living transmission ended, the texts became unreadable. For 17 centuries, no one could read cuneiform. The tablets existed, but the knowledge they contained was inaccessible. It wasn't until the 19th century, when scholars painstakingly reconstructed the writing system through comparison and cryptanalysis, that Sumerian texts could be read again. So the bloodline wasn't necessary to preserve the information, but it was necessary to preserve the knowledge. The difference matters. Information can survive in dormant form, scratches in clay, symbols on paper, data in silicon. Knowledge requires active transmission, teachers and students, practitioners and apprentices, living minds engaged with living minds. The Sumerian system used bloodline as the mechanism for ensuring that active transmission. It wasn't perfect. Bloodlines ended, dynasties fell, knowledge was still lost, but for over 2,000 years it worked better than perhaps any other system we know. Now we have different methods: universal literacy, public education, open access to information, democratic ideals opposing hereditary privilege. We've broken the connection between bloodline and knowledge access, and we consider this moral progress. But we've replaced it with new forms of restriction, economic barriers to education, professional credentialing, institutional gatekeeping, specialisation so extreme that knowledge fragments into silos. We've solved the bloodline problem by making knowledge so dispersed that no one holds enough of it to understand the whole system. The Sumerians would have seen this as civilizational suicide. If knowledge is too fragmented, if no one understands how the pieces connect, if the system requires such complex coordination that disruption causes collapse, then you've sacrificed resilience for access. Maybe they'd be right. Modern civilization is more complex, but also more fragile than Sumerian civilization. Our knowledge systems depend on technologies and institutions that could fail catastrophically. The internet could go down, universities could close. Entire fields of knowledge exist in so few specialists that one generation's disruption could end them. The texts in museum vaults don't answer this. They only pose the question, what responsibility do we have to knowledge itself? Not just to discovering it or accessing it, but to preserving it across time, to ensuring it survives us. The Sumerian answer was, make people responsible. Specific people, families, bloodlines. If your grandfather preserved this knowledge and your father preserved it, you will preserve it because it's yours. Your inheritance, your burden, your identity. That's not our answer. We make institutions responsible. Universities, libraries, museums, archives. We hope they'll outlast us and protect knowledge impersonally, systematically. But institutions fail too. They lose funding. They change missions. They surrender to political pressure. They become corrupt. They make catastrophically bad decisions about what to preserve and what to discard. The Sumerians' deepest insight might be this: knowledge preservation is not a technical problem, it's a human problem. It requires people who care enough to protect it, who are invested enough to transmit it, who identify strongly enough with it that its loss would mean their own loss. Bloodline was their mechanism for creating that identity. Not the only possible mechanism, but one that worked. You protected knowledge because it was your family's knowledge, your city's knowledge, your God's knowledge given to your ancestors to guard. When that identity broke, when people stopped believing in the gods, stopped respecting the bloodlines, stopped seeing knowledge preservation as their sacred duty, the knowledge died. Not immediately, the tablets remained, but the living transmission ended, and with it, the civilization. This is what the king list records, ultimately. Not a chronology of rulers, but a genealogy of knowledge, a documentation of who held it, how long they held it, what happened when they lost it, and how the chain was restored when possible. The 8 antediluvian kings represent the deep past, the time when the system was established, when knowledge first descended from heaven to earth, when the bloodlines that would carry it were designated. The astronomical reign lengths measure not individual lives, but institutional tenure, the vast time depths across which knowledge remained stable. The flood represents catastrophic disruption. Whatever it was historically, it symbolises the edge of survival, the moment when everything nearly ended. Ziusudra is the carrier through the crisis, the one bloodline that preserved enough to rebuild. The post-flood dynasties represent the ongoing work of maintenance, the continuous effort required to keep knowledge alive, to train each generation, to repair what breaks, to adapt what must change while preserving what must persist. And the gradual decrease in reign lengths represents not human lifespans returning to normal, but the increasing difficulty of preservation. The deeper into the past the knowledge source recedes, the harder it becomes to maintain direct continuity, the more the chain attenuates, until finally the chain breaks. The last scribe who could read old Sumerian dies. The last priest who knew the rituals converts. The last craftsman who held the technique takes it to his grave, and the knowledge becomes information, present but inert, available but incomprehensible, unless someone, someday, puts in the massive effort required to reconstruct it, to learn dead languages, to decode forgotten symbols, to reverse engineer lost techniques, to become, in a sense, the restoration of the bloodline, not biologically, but intellectually, to take on the responsibility of keeping. That's what archaeologists and scholars do when they excavate and translate these texts. They're reforging the broken chain, reconnecting us to knowledge we lost, not because we're descended from those who held it, but because we choose to care that it was lost. We choose to become its keepers again. The texts can't tell us if knowledge genuinely required special bloodlines to be preserved. They can only show us that the Sumerians believed it did, and they organised their entire civilization around protecting the transmission. They created a system that lasted millennia, and when the system finally broke, the knowledge died with it, until we, 4,000 years later, learnt to read their writing again and became the unexpected heirs to what they guarded. What we do with that inheritance remains to be seen. Whether we preserve it, build on it, or let it fade again. The clay remains, the wedges pressed into its surface, the names of kings, the lengths of their reigns. The flood swept over. Kingship descended from heaven. The question it poses silently: to whom will you pass what you know? Who will remember when you're gone? What bloodline, literal or chosen, will carry forward what matters? The texts don't force an answer. They only document that the question matters, that civilizations rise and fall on how they answer it. That knowledge is more fragile than we imagine, more precious than we know, and that somewhere, always, someone must be willing to keep it. To be the bloodline, biological or intellectual or spiritual, that transmits what must not die. If this resonated with you, if you found something worth keeping in these ancient records, I'd appreciate you letting me know in the comments, not for the algorithm, for the knowing that somewhere someone received what was offered here, that the chain continues in whatever form it takes now. The prism rests in Oxford, the knowledge waits, as it always has, as it always will, until someone chooses to carry it forward.